There we go. Welcome to the Colombia Reports podcast. We are joined by Tomas Molina, a university professor and political scientist from Bogota. And today we're going to talk about manufacturing consent and particularly in the context of an armed conflict, which is a bit relevant at the moment because everybody is reading up um, on the conflict, on the armed conflict in Ukraine. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Adrian. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. You asked me to talk about manufacturing consent. Can you tell me why you believe this is relevant at the moment?
Yes. So we usually associate propaganda with totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, right? Because their propaganda is pretty straightforward. If you go to the Soviet Union, for example, they had a newspaper called Pravda, and Pravda means truth in Russian, and everybody knew in Russia that in Pravda there is no truth. So the Russian people, Soviet people, knew that their official sources of information were pure propaganda. So in the West, Sovietologists studied Pravda just because it was clearly the organ of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So they didn't expect it to report faithfully. They just expected to know what the Russian government, the Soviet government at the moment was thinking, right? And we just associate propaganda with regimes like that. You can say the same thing about China, right? And we all know about censorship in China, and we know how the Chinese government treats dissidents and the concentration camps, of Muslims, etc., etc. We all know that. But Chomsky has a very interesting point in his book,
Yeah,
Manufacturing
let's
Consent.
yeah let's go back because manufacturing
Yes,
consent is a book by Noam Chomsky, the American uh, he's
linguist.
linguist, but also like a political dissident.
Yes,
And he talks about he says that manufacturing consent, he makes the point that in there's also a propaganda model in democratic societies.
exactly.
If you could please explain
Yes.
how that model works.
Yeah, exactly. So what Chomsky shows is that propaganda um, is not exclusive to totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. It's just different in democracies because um, in democracies you find the free press, right? So you would expect it to have dissenting views and different views, and to a certain extent, there are dissenting views, at least certainly more than in the Soviet Union, right, where you could only say your opinion in a very limited uh, manner.
Well,
So in
and
democracies you expect,
you couldn't get it published in Pravda. Like
yeah, exactly,
if you
right,
wanted to be in Pravda, then you had to
follow the
replicate.
party line.
Yeah,
Exactly. So in democracies like the United States, or at least countries that call themselves democracies, liberal democracies, you expect them to have a free press. But what Chomsky finds, and he documents this extensively in his book and in his articles, and throughout his whole um, life, is that since at least the Second World War, media has been increasingly concentrated in a few corporate hands. And the corporate media presents the political events around the world from a very narrow perspective. So, yes, you can find conservative media like Fox News, and you can find more liberal media like the New York Times. But the the media almost never question the basic ideological presuppositions of the United States, for example. And there's almost no media that reports from the perspective of workers. So everything is reported from the perspective of corporate interests and the what are perceived by the elites of the United States, the national interests of the United States. You know what they think the national interests are. So you're gonna find, for example, that whenever the United States wants to invade a country, in lots of media, you know, even media that you'd consider more academic, like foreign policy, for example, or foreign affairs, which are the magazines of the foreign policy establishment of the United States, you're gonna see that there are a lot of op-ed pieces in which they try to sort of introduce the idea of an invasion to see what people are going to say, right? And they use all sorts of rhetorical devices and manipulation to try to show that whatever the United States wants is just and liberal and in the interests of the rest of the world. And we all know that's not the case, but you know that's what the propaganda machine wants to show. But so
Can you
you know,
can you
good.
explain how this propaganda machine works, like in
Yes,
practice?
yeah,
Like can
yes, right.
you like how does this propaganda model proposed by Chomsky work?
Yeah, right. So what Chomsky says is that contrary to authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, journalists and the people who work in media don't necessarily think that they're in favor of a regime or a model of society, etc., etc. I mean, they don't think of themselves as propagandists, right? It's not their subjective position. If you worked in Pravda in the Soviet Union, you didn't have any illusions. You know what you were doing, right? Unless you were really naive. But Russian people are not usually naive, so they knew what they were doing. And you can actually see it now in Russian today. Lots of journalists are complaining, or at least that's what we hear, because the propaganda machine is just too obvious, and they're saying like this is just too much. We can't do this. Um, but in democratic societies, journalists think of themselves as objective. So what Chomsky says is that they're not doing it on purpose. They're trying to report objectively. But he says there's a trap. First of all, they work for
There
a
are
corporation.
filters that
Exactly. So they
basically
work, which
that
is the
basic
first filter.
yeah
The corporation. So you work for a corporation and you serve the interests of that corporation. What are the interests of that corporation? To sell ads. Right? That's what the corporation wants, and to defend the interests of its owners, of course. But media sell ads because that's their main source of income. So the corporations have to serve also the interests of the corporations to which they sell ads.
yeah. So
Um,
they would have to cater to a large audience in order
exactly.
to be profitable, and in order to be in if you want to cater to a large audience, you have to report
Yeah,
well
exactly.
in a certain way.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Exactly. So even though journalists don't know it, they're reporting in a certain way and serving certain interests. And there's a very interesting interview in which Chomsky talks with Andrew Marr from the BBC, and he says like, I mean, Andrew Marr says, "Look, I'm not trying to spread propaganda or anything. I'm just doing my job." And and Chomsky says, "Well, if you thought differently, you wouldn't be here. Like the trick is that you think you're objective and you're a good journalist, but you have always served the interests of the powerful.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean that there's no dissent. Chomsky does accept that there's dissent, and sometimes, big corporations, big media corporations accept dissent in their ranks because it sells. Uh, but it has a very, I mean, dissent has a very limited acceptance. So most media companies only accept a very narrow ideological
Yeah, so
spectrum.
if you take that spectrum, you would, in American media, you would say that the debate is limited to like liberal versus conservative or democratic versus conservative. But if someone moves beyond that, so I remember that in the United States there was like Ralph Nader and the Green Party at one point. When they were being introduced, they were like reporting on that political choice as a legitimate political choice was quite aggressively marginalized, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Right. It all depends on the spectrum. So if you look at what people were writing in the 1960s, like political scientists, you're going to find that they considered the extreme right to be people who basically wanted to dismantle the welfare state. That was the extreme right in the 19. It was unthinkable. Only very, extreme people thought that dismantling the welfare state was a good idea and dismantling the New Deal, et cetera, et cetera. That's now the new normal. Like that's what is accepted as good. And um, in the United States, you can be even more extreme now and still be considered part of the moderate Republicans. Um,
So, and when you look at media, that means that like there's been a shift
yes,
in how in what type of political thought is being considered acceptable and
exactly,
thus gets a place in the media.
exactly. So if you have what in the 1960s would have been moderate leftist views, that's considered extremist in the American media, for example. Even if you still have moderate social democratic views uh, from your current European perspective, that's going to be considered extreme in the United. Like Bernie Sanders, for example, he would be like a moderate centrist in Sweden, but he's considered an extremist in the United States.
Yeah, um, which is kind of, it's interesting because like as a journalist from the Netherlands reporting for an American audience, I notice exactly that filter like being applied, like where there's it's even like a cultural filter, like there are certain things that I consider normal simply because like they've always been normal,
Exactly.
and then when I report for a foreign audience, for example like an American audience, then it stops being normal, and what to me is like something that my mother taught me suddenly becomes like a political thing,
Yes.
which is interesting.
Yes. And that's why there's a political fight for the common sense. What do we consider common sense? And since the 1980s, the common sense have shifted to the right. So common what we think in America as a continent, not only the United States, but as a continent, as commonsensic, is actually something new, and it comes from the Thatcher and Reagan revolution, right? So privatization of everything doesn't matter if it works or not. We have to privatize it. The market always works better than the state, which is not empirically correct. Sometimes, yeah, sometimes that's not true.
Because
But
this is where things get interesting, because like if you look at like Reagan and Thatcher and that type of political thoughts, there is plenty to question about those trains of thought, like the very fundaments of it. Like you have healthcare, for example, and the uh, uh, people like the so-called neoliberals would argue that that needs to be privatized in order to function better.
Mhm,
Um, but there's plenty to argue in favor of, like, well, is there any empirical evidence
mhm.
to sustain, well, to even claim that privatization works? What are the examples of it working?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And but that discussion is just not possible today in the sense that it's. I mean, if you question the privatization dogma, you're going to be excluded, and people are going to say that you're an extremist, just because you're questioning the contemporary common sense. But it was possible to do that 50 years ago. Why isn't it possible to do it now? If there are, you know, things that we need to question. So there's again a manufacturing of consent. So the media has played a part in this, because columnists and documentaries, etc., have sold us on the idea that uh, only the neoliberal approach is scientific, and it's the only one that will bring progress. And there's a lot of evidence to the contrary.
Yeah. Can we because like I don't know all that much about the United States. So can we focus on Colombia as a
Yeah.
subject? So like how certain, let's say, orthodoxies in the public debate when it comes to Colombia have become sort of mainstream, while there is merit to discuss like the validity of it, like especially because now that there's a conflict in Ukraine. I thought it
Mhm.
would be interesting if we talked about reporting on the conflict in Colombia, like how, like our experiences,
Yes.
um, because I suspect that's like that mistakes have been made in reporting on Colombia's conflict that would be relevant, like for how we interpret information that we receive on Ukraine. So, like, how can you give me an example of uh, reporting in the media on the Colombian conflict that requires scrutiny?
Yes. Well, Adrian, I would like to start by saying that we need to question again the common sense. Common sense tells us that if you are living in a country, you know more about what's happening in the country than foreigners, and that's not necessarily true. And you can see that precisely in the Colombian case. So Colombians have been uh, subjected to a lot of propaganda when it comes to the armed conflict, but not exclusively so. Um, and lots of people think that they're well informed, but they aren't. And
Also,
it's
because when you live in a country, like if you look at like the volume of information you can absorb, that's equal to living in a country or outside it. But
yes,
if you live in a conflict or in a conflict situation, like a lot of the information would be emotional
yes,
and not necessarily factual.
yes, yes. But there's also the manufacturing of consent, and that's why you can see, for example, that sometimes if you want accurate reporting of what's happening in Colombia, checking foreign media is actually better than checking the Colombian media. Not always, but sometimes, because uh, foreign journalists are not or have not been subject to propaganda, so they will report things in a more accurate manner. So let me give you an example.
Or
Um,
their media outlets don't have a direct
exactly.
interest in the specifics of that conflict in that
Uh
country.
huh. Yeah, uh-huh. So because they have no interest, I mean no economic or political interest, they can report more accurately. So let me give you an example. So there have been some studies about the way the Colombian media reported on the armed conflict, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s. And what they have discovered is that whenever the FARC guerrilla killed people or did something that a criminal act or whatever, the media reported um, what happened in a very sentimental way. So they said like, oh, these people that the guerrilla kidnapped had families, and they their dreams have been truncated, and well, I mean, and it's good that they did that, because kidnapping is a terrible crime.
Well,
But
yeah,
the thing,
there's like, well, if I may, as a journalist, if you want people to identify with the victims, like you use their names, you
exactly.
say how many children they have, and you give specifics about the lives of victims,
Yes.
which would be the the good way to do journalism if you care about the victims. But
Yes.
if you look at, like, it's really interesting. I've read one of those studies that you mentioned. If the this has been done adequately when it comes to crimes committed by the FARC or other guerrilla
Hmm.
groups, but you
Hmm.
notice that there's like an anonymization of victims when it comes to violence committed by the military, by the state,
Hmm. Hmm.
and by paramilitaries that have
Hmm.
been associated by the state
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
the state.
Hmm. Yeah, that's precisely it. So whenever the paramilitaries massacred people, uh, the Colombian media reported it as, 7 people were killed, in in
Or 7 people died.
exactly, like mysteriously tied, so nobody killed them.
Uh
So
huh.
they used the passive voice to minimize the um, the perpetrator, right? I mean, they when the FARC guerrilla killed somebody, they used the active voice. So they said, the FARC killed this many people.
Mm-hmm.
But when the paramilitaries or the army killed people, it suddenly was natural to use the passive voice. So there was no killer; people just died. So there was no empathy towards the victims. Victims were just anonymous,
Can you
like they
explain
came.
how that works? Because I can't imagine that an individual journalist um, consciously thinks like, oh, we need to make these people invisible because their suffering is somehow politically inconvenient. Like, I don't believe that this is like a conscious process.
Yes, it's not. It's not. It's just part of habits, because of all the filters. So you have the corporate interests, and um, you have the the ads to sell, and you have um, the way that information has been presented, usually, right? So journalists become habituated to presenting information in a certain way, so they don't even think about the way they're presenting the information, because it's just the way it's always been done.
Especially
um,
when there's like such a repetitive violence,
uh,
and you write about a massacre every other day, like it becomes a,
mhm.
well, it's, you stop being angry about it.
Yes, yes, Adrian. And there's another thing, which is that amongst the middle classes and the upper class in Colombia in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of sympathy towards the paramilitaries. So you could hear in those days that the paramilitaries were going to save the country from the FARC. Lots of people believed that, and people said that openly in cafes and restaurants and that sort of places.
Well, and to the extent that, according to Salvatore Mancuso, one of the former commanders of the AUC, he was invited to the newsroom of El Tiempo to talk about the goals of the AUC. Now,
Mhm.
if you are a leftist working at the El Tiempo, that must be pretty intimidating.
Mhm.
Having that guy like in the newsroom invited by your boss.
Mhm. Yes. Yes, and the paramilitaries killed a lot of journalists because, especially in rural areas, it was pretty easy to kill them, and nobody was going to ask uh, about their deaths. It was just going to be reported as, two journalists died this whatever town, remote town in Colombia. So it was not important to the establishment, because there was also an association between left wing views and the guerrilla. Even though Colombia has a long tradition of democratic leftist politics, there was a propaganda trick. So they were able to connect left-wing views with guerrilla. So if you basically defended workers' rights, so for example, trade unions, you were classified as a sympathizer of whatever guerrilla was killing people at the moment.
You
Um,
notice that the because that may be another filter that applies like in situations of war, and definitely in Colombia. Like I was reading the defense minister the other day who was asking the ELN, which has been carrying out a terror campaign over the past few days. He asked the ELN to say who they are campaigning for, which is pretty delicate when you're in presidential elections. So like, it's easy if your reporting somehow slants to serve whatever talking points a guerrilla group may have, that a government says that you are serving the guerrillas.
right. Yeah. Right.
And even so, if I may, like, um, during I noticed that a lot of media aren't reporting on the terror campaign, like the paro armado of the guerrillas, because
Hmm.
also the paro armado is essentially a propaganda campaign. Like the guerrillas want to show how weak the government is. So like
Hmm.
by showing how weak the government is, and how much suffering is being inflicted on the civilian population, you don't serve the civilian population, but you serve the military interests of the guerrillas.
Yes. Yes. And I think we also have to take into account, now that we're talking of all these connections, that there's also bridge between the journalistic world in Colombia and the elite. So many journalists have family connections to the elite, or they, belong to the elite, like the Santos family, right?
Yeah,
Which were one of
let's get into specifics there, because
yeah,
like you can say that, but yeah, let's talk about the Santos family.
right.
I know that. So you have like Juan Manuel Santos, the former president of Colombia,
Yes.
who signed peace with the FARC, but his family is particularly close um, to the media. So can you tell me, can you give me some specifics, like how close they are um, with the media?
Yes. Well, Eduardo Santos, who was the president of Colombia in the 1930s, if my memory serves me right, was also the CEO or president, however you want to call it, of El Tiempo, which is the most important newspaper in Colombia. Still today, it's the most important newspaper. So he was the most powerful man in the country, not only because he was the president of Colombia, but also because he was the most influential man through his newspaper. So no conservative newspaper was as influential as El Tiempo, and that gives you the chance to swing the political opinions of people in such a manner that uh, wouldn't be possible in other uh, situations.
So
So
Eduardo Santos was the great uncle of President Juan Manuel Santos, right?
yes, yes,
And his grandson was Francisco Santos,
yes,
who
hmm,
was the editor in chief of El Tiempo in the late
uh-huh,
1990s,
yes,
when the
and whose
AUC
cousin?
was fighting the when
Uh-huh,
violence like between the paramilitaries and the guerrillas was
exactly,
peaking.
exactly, and his cousin of Juan Manuel. So they're related, and Francisco Santos is also part of El Centro Democrático. So you can see a clear connection between uh, the elite and the journalistic establishment. And if you take a look at, for example, the biggest names in journalism today in Colombia, you'll see that they're either married to important politicians or they're related to them in indirect ways, like their brother or sister married an important politician, a member of the establishment.
Yeah, because you're talking about El Tiempo in the 1940s when they were
Yes.
owned by Eduardo Santos. But if you look at El Tiempo today, you still see like in the bylines like names like Samper
Uh-huh.
and Santos, if I'm correct, like Diego Santos, who's also
Yes.
family of the former president.
Yes.
He he almost became the boss of Twitter a few years ago.
Yes.
Um, is
Yes.
is that is that the only example? No, because you have like newspaper El Tiempo too, which serves particularly different interests.
Yes, and if you
Of
take a
El
look at
Colombiano, I mean
uh-huh,
newspaper El
yeah, yeah,
Colombiano.
exactly. So if you take a look at El Nuevo Siglo and El Colombiano, they have also been serving conservative interests, and they've been connected to the most important conservative families of Colombia, like the
The
Gomez
Gomez
family, right?
and the Hernandez
Exactly.
family.
Uh-huh. Exactly.
Il-
So there's
The
a clear connection. Yeah.
because you um, is it really conspiratorial to say that these media also serve like the electoral interests of these individual families, like and for example like um, how media influence like public opinion about um, like for example like take former president Santos, like did El Tiempo have like influence how people perceived the government of President Santos?
Well, probably less than before because the internet has changed everything. So there's I mean the almost monopoly that El Tiempo had in the 1990s is no longer. But yes, of course, it's influenced the way people see the government and the establishment at large. And you can also see that, for example, in Blue Radio, which is one of the most influential radio stations in Colombia. Colombia is a place in which people still listen to a lot of radio, like everyone from whatever social class, uh, especially
Because
older.
Blue Radio is
Yes,
the director is Nestor Morales, he's called,
yes,
and
exactly.
he's a brother-in-law of President Ivan Duque.
Exactly, precisely that. And Blue Radio is part of the Santo Domingo Group, which is the um, the property of the Santo Domingo family, which is one of the most powerful, and it's probably the richest, or if not one of the richest families in Colombia. So there's connection to the, you know, oligarchic elite and the political elite.
Now, usually, like media, in order to prevent um, like media need to cater to large audiences in order to be profitable, and they have to be loyal to their audience too in order to work. um,
Yes.
you can argue that with so many family ties and corporate ties, this is impossible in Colombia. um, then the rise of the internet and social media in particular must have had like a massive impact on um, well the functioning of the traditional media.
Yes. But the the establishment has also been very um, intelligent, uh, and it's become tech savvy when it comes to using social media to advance its own interests. So you can see that, for example, when people had to vote yes or no to the peace process with the FARC, so the right wing establishment, extreme right wing, I'd say, um, had a campaign in which, through WhatsApp messages and Facebook posts, etc., it was able to convince people that they had to vote no to the peace process. And so the social media is not necessarily this realm of freedom in which everyone can speak his or her own mind. And I mean, it may be that, but there is also manipulation and there is also propaganda in social media. And you also have to take into account that Colombia is a place in which most people don't have access to the internet. And if they have, it's a very limited access. So most people still get their news from the radio. So W Radio, for example, W Radio, Blue Radio, Blue Radio still have a lot of sway over vast swaths of the Colombian population.
So, um, more than um, more than in for example like the United States or Western European countries, like traditional media outlets are still extremely influential on public opinion in Colombia.
I'd say so. Yes, there are still, I
Also,
think.
like there has been talks about um, bodegas, or let's call them
Mhm.
sweatshops,
Yes,
of like where political forces or political parties use like or create like groups of people that will promote whatever their political message is, like with the
yes,
use of social media, particularly Twitter.
yes.
Um, I've seen this in Colombia, but I can imagine that like if this would be a thing in any democracy.
Yes, yes. I mean, there are lots of disinformation campaigns on social media. And for example, if we take a look at what Russia is doing now and the United States is doing now on social media, you can clearly see that lots of um, ideas that circulate appear to come from anonymous citizens, but it's pretty obvious that they're the result of a propaganda campaign from whatever government. There was a video circulating this morning on the Colombian Twitter, and it was a Russian journalist who speaks perfect Spanish. It wasn't Ina, it was another one, and she was saying that Russia is a victim of imperialist aggression, etc., etc. But
Serious?
there was no way to know that she was a journalist from Russia Today. She appeared to be like a concerned citizen. So if you watch that video, you can think, oh well, yes, Russia has been a victim, and NATO is at fault, etc., etc. But it's not the case. Like it's a conscious propaganda effort to convince people of something.
And as again, like people in Colombia were subjected to aggressive propaganda during the armed conflict
Yes.
in Colombia. Now that there's a different armed conflict where global opinion matters, you should, as a news consumer, you should expect to be subjected to all kinds of misinformation and propaganda.
Yes. Actually,
Is
to the
is
point.
there a way to sort of like shield your or like to arm yourself, like and to prevent being um, convinced of stuff that just isn't true?
It's really difficult because if you take a look, for example, at the scientific community, right? For example, the social sciences. And if you read the most influential journals, they're also very highly ideological, which is something that, for example, James Galbraith has denounced in
What do you mean?
Sorry?
What do you mean that even like scientific journals are highly
Yes.
ideological?
Yes. So, for example, let's talk about economics. So, um, there are, some top journals in which you have to publish if you want to get tenure at an important university, because those are the journals. And it doesn't mean that there aren't other excellent journals. It just means that those are the journals that matter uh,
To
to the
universities.
yes, exactly. And most of those journals have a very strict, how to put it, editorial line, which is very highly ideological as well. So
Can
there,
you give me an example?
yeah, yeah, like there, if you try to question the basic assumptions of neoclassical, orthodox theory, they're just not going to publish your manuscript. They may say to you like, all right, like this isn't bad, but we're not into that. They're only going to publish whatever uh, they think is acceptable, which is, to a certain extent obvious, because if you're going to try, for example, to publish, I don't know, like um, a psychoanalytical article in a psychology journal that's about CBT, they're not going to publish it because it's not their deal. So that's to be expected. But so because scientific journals in the social sciences are ideological in the sense that they have like if you take a look at the most important journals in international relations and political
So
science.
but you mean that, for example, if you're a proponent of Keynesian or social or socialist economics, you're saying that you wouldn't get as much, you wouldn't be published.
Not in those journals anyway. Not in those journals. No, because they're going to think that
Not in the
whatever you're saying
journals
is
that
wrong.
matter.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So they're not going to publish your work in those journals. You have to look for Keynesian journals, and those journals don't matter when you want to get tenure unless
Wait,
you want to work for
I didn't even know that existed Keynesian journals.
yes, yes, of course. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so you can get a job, of course, if you publish in Keynesian journals. It's just not going to be a job in
In
top
Harvard.
universities. Yeah, at least not now. It was different in the 1960s, but because there was a Keynesian orthodoxy, it was the dominant paradigm. But today the situation is different. So, like it was saying, if you go to the top political science journals, you're also going to see, sorry, an ideological bias, and it doesn't matter if your work is good. They're only going to publish whatever they think is correct, which is again, perfectly normal and acceptable. But I mean, it does mean
Because you
that
say it's always been this way, but you notice like just contemporary shifts in bias.
yes. And so if you want to be a well-informed person and you have an interest in the social sciences, you have to know that there's still going to be biases and untruths being presented as truths just because they're part of the current ideological spectrum, and whatever doesn't fit that spectrum is going to be excluded. Even though we're talking about science and people who are working honestly on a subject, it's not that, again, it's like journalists. They're social
Yeah,
scientists aren't being most of
it's
the
not
time
that they want to
socialists.
push a certain. It's not that they're trying to like push a certain ideology,
Yeah,
but the system kind of filters them to the
exactly,
margin.
exactly. That's it. That's it. And
And
if you,
if I may, so you said that in the 1960s, when Keynesian economics was the orthodoxy, um, what are now called neoliberal thinkers were also pushed to the margin.
yes, yes, they were. Yes. So they were considered extremists, basically. So in the 1960s, uh, you know, the Reaganomics would have been considered madness. And actually, if you take a look at the Conservative Party in Britain in the 1980s, many of its members considered that what Thatcher was doing was completely extreme and that she was out of her mind. So it's not only in the 1960s, even in the 80s, it was considered madness.
So if we now use your your average person obviously doesn't read
Mhm.
scholarly papers, but I imagine that it also influences like which expert is being invited to to be interviewed in a in in a news outlet with a large audience.
Mhm. Yes. Yes. And obviously, the media are going to invite people who don't radically question the ideological biases of the current establishment.
In
They
fact,
can.
in fact,
Mhm.
I noticed that so President Ivan Duque traveled to the Netherlands the other week. I'm currently in the Netherlands, and he gave an interview to a newspaper in which he talked rubbish.
Mhm.
Like he blamed like people snorting cocaine for the deforestation in Colombia, for example, which is obviously utter nonsense. But like because he is the president, he is the authority. A newspaper will allow him to speak like in an exclusive interview without like talking about like a farmer from Guaviare who is able to witness the deforestation.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So
So there's
that's
also a
another filter.
bias. There's also a bias towards the people who are in power.
Yes, yes. So if you take a look at the Colombian radio stations, you know, the most important ones anyway, you'll see that they will always interview people. I mean, they will give a lot of space to these supposed experts, and they will have, you know, sometimes half an hour, 40 minutes to explain their position. But when they interview regular people on subjects that matter to them, they only have 30 seconds to speak and then they hang up the phone. So it's clearly biased. So the even if the
Even though you
experts.
could argue that, for example, a farmer from Guaviare has the empirical knowledge
Mhm,
to talk, for example, about deforestation or the control of guerrilla groups in a certain region more
mhm.
than an established scholar from Bogota would.
Yes, in a certain sense, yes. And
I mean, like he wouldn't have the analytical. He may not have the analytical ability, but at least people from the population will be able to contribute data that allows analysis.
well, that's exactly Chomsky's point. So he says that before 1945 and before the 1930s in the United States, there were a lot of working class newspapers in which regular people exposed their views, um, and other working class people read those newspapers. So not only the economic or political or academic establishment had an opinion, which is mostly the case today. So I mean, we have pseudo experts and experts monopolizing the radio and the TV and even social media, But what about regular people who can, also have valid opinions on lots of subjects?
or
So that that
valid
disappeared.
observations of what is happening in the
Uh-huh.
country.
Yes, yes. So if you take a look at the people who have a say in the radio, you're gonna know, at least in Colombia. I don't know about the states or about Europe, but in Colombia, I'm guessing it's similar. But if you take a look at what happens here, it's mostly white people, with university degrees, and they almost always belong to the establishment. um, and so they do allow some dissenting views, but only in a very narrow spectrum. So you, for example, in Blue Radio, you have some leftist views sometimes, but they're ridiculed, and they can only be um,
So like
said if
therefore
they're
for
not.
decoration, you mean, or
Yeah, and if they fit this narrow spectrum.
hmm and that means you mean leftist people, but not too leftist.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that there's this fantasy in Colombia that if you if you spouse leftist views, you're automatically a radical and you want to destroy the country. So views that would be normal in Europe are considered completely extreme and utter madness in Colombia. So even social democracy is considered extreme. Um, and so they will only allow the the critical position that doesn't undermine the establishment. So they are critical. It's not that they aren't, because like you said before, they have to please their audiences, and audiences sometimes want blood, right? Like expose a corrupt politician, etc., etc. But as long as it doesn't undermine the establishment as a whole, so they can undermine uh, politicians, like a particular politician, but not the stuff that you will never hear a critique of ideology on the
Well,
radio.
I
It
noticed
just.
something interesting the other day. I read that multiple liberal presidential candidates were saying that free trade agreements need to be renegotiated, which is something that I've never heard anyone say. And suddenly, like presidential candidates are are actually saying it, and these are liberal, so like classical liberal politicians, not social democrats, who are, well, to me that's almost, that sounded almost like blasphemy. But has that also come in the newspapers, or does that not go beyond social media?
It does happen on newspapers, but that's a moderate perspective, like saying, okay, we need to renegotiate point one and point 10 of the free trade agreement. That's a moderate
What would be a
position. I mean,
radical, what would be a radical position then?
well, a radical position would be to adopt an entirely different economic model, but nobody's proposing that,
Can you give me
because
an example
of what exactly?
of a new model? Like
Well,
have people made any such propositions?
well, I don't think so, and I think not even Petro has proposed a new model. He just wants to reform what we have now. He wants to make some drastic changes. That's true, but I mean, nobody's proposing communism, which would be a, a complete change. And I mean, um, everyone's just trying to reform uh, our current capitalist system from a narrow perspective. So the centrist one, which is all right, like things aren't good for working class people, so we can give them a bit more education, maybe reform the health system to make it a bit more efficient. But what we're doing is fine. And the right wing position, which is no, actually, we shouldn't give people more education. We should just make them work, and things are gonna turn out fine if people work, and that's it. Like it's it's a continuation of what we have.
So
Um,
you're saying that even the most supposedly radical candidate, Gustavo Petro, is really only proposing tweaking the system.
yes, I think he's got some radical proposals. For example, he wants to end our dependence uh, on oil, which is radical to a country like Colombia because oil is our main export. So yes, definitely,
It's
that's the
also
radical.
not very different from like it would just like make Colombia like many other economies that have no oil whatsoever.
Yes, yes.
So what? Why is that so radical? Like, if many countries don't have access to oil, why is having an economy that's not based on oil radical?
Well, I mean, even the Arab countries are trying to uh, be less dependent on oil, and so they have expanded their financial services, their tourism sector, etc. I think what unnerves some people is first that a left wing candidate is proposing that, which is always a no no for them. And the
Because it
other
kind of
thing,
appeals to um, prejudices
yes,
that
definitely.
this is going to be an entirely different system.
Yes, yes. I think, I mean, if you look, you can take uh, any idea that Petro has, and if you give it to a right wing or a centrist candidate, it's gonna become more palatable. Just because a centrist candidate is saying it, it's just that. But I
But
mean, I think
that's like the it would just sound different. Like they would be saying the same things but using different words. You're saying.
yeah, but I mean, if you take a look at Uribe, for example, when Petro says, "All right, we need to give education to our youth," um, Uribe says, "Yes, we need to give education to our youth." And suddenly, if Uribe says it, oh yeah, it's right. Nobody asks him like, "How are you going to do it? Do you have the budget to?" Nobody asks any questions. It's just Uri. All right, okay. But if Petro proposes it, it suddenly becomes a sin. But I was
Well,
just going to say that
there
there's
was like
another factor.
something. There was something utterly weird the other day where I heard. I believe it was Oscar Iwan Zuluaga, the candidate for the far right Centro Democrático, proposing price controls on the
Yes.
foodstuffs.
Yes,
Now,
exactly.
that's not like that's completely out of the ballpark.
Yes. Hmm. Yes. And if a right wing candidate proposes that, I mean, some people might say, "All right, it seems like a bad idea," but it doesn't provoke the negative
It doesn't
emotions.
freak people out as it,
Uh
but
huh.
if Petra would make the same proposals,
Hmm.
it would be interpreted as a radical idea.
Yes, but there's another reason why people are unnerved by Petra's proposal, and by people I mean usually upper class people or upper middle class people. Um, and that is that, well, and I don't agree with Petra on this one, but he says that we need to stop exporting oil, which might be inconvenient, because the Colombian state is very bad at taxing uh, rich Colombians, so it doesn't have a lot of sources of income. So if we stop exporting oil, we're gonna lose a very important source of income. So I mean that does seem inconvenient, but it's clear that even though his method should be changed, we need to stop our dependence on oil. And in that sense, he's
Well,
actually
because
the
sooner or
opposite
later you're
of
going to
Venezuela.
run out of oil. Like it's not that you have like
Yes.
an infinite amount. Like if you,
Yeah, yeah. We are not a big producer of oil. If you look at it from an international perspective, and we are running out of oil. That's just a fact. They haven't found significant amounts of oil in years.
By the
We're
way,
just running out of oil.
you said something interesting about um, the uh, the public reaction that this was like mainly among rich or middle upper class Colombians. Like
Yes.
these would also be the people who buy newspapers.
Hmm.
Um, because more than in a so-called developed country, Colombia's poor people really don't have the money to get a subscription to a newspaper.
Hmm. Yes.
So this would also provide like a, a clear media bias in who they cater.
Yes. Uh-huh. Which is also Chomsky's point. So Chomsky says that the manufacturing of consent is um, directed at the top of, the population, like managers, doctors, engineers, well-paid professionals, because they are the ones that count in companies, in even in voting. If you take a look at how people vote in Colombia, you'll see that rich people tend to vote more than poor people. So, and they always vote right wing, almost always, because they're very, I mean, they know what their interests are and they vote accordingly. So you see, for example, that in Usaquén, one of the richest um, parts of Bogota, people voted for Miguel Uribe, right, which was the right wing candidate and part of a traditional political family.
You mean in the 2019 local elections?
In the previous mayor elections,
Hmm.
yeah. So people in Usaquén voted for Miguel Uribe. The rest of the city didn't vote for him. Just they just didn't. Um, but like everybody went out to vote. Could you give me just a sec, Adrian? Just a sec.
Sure.
All right, sorry.
No worries.
So yeah, so rich people vote, and because they have a lot to lose, or so they
but
think.
but that also has like a major effect on democracy. Like you're
Yes.
like supposedly uh, like journalism is supposed to be an elementary part of a liberal democracy and provides like a citizen check on political power. But if media are only defending the interests of a certain layer of the population, then they are not fulfilling the role that they pretend to be playing. Am I correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, there are independent media in Colombia, and left
But
wing
but are
media.
but are those independent media also serving the part of the population that can't afford a newspaper?
Yeah, because they're free. Mm, it's just that they're usually on the internet, and most people don't have access to the internet. Uh, so it's more difficult to get to them. That's the
So
issue.
it's more difficult for those independent media to have the same impact as the traditional
Exactly.
media,
Uh-huh. That's it.
particularly
Yeah.
specifically radio stations. You were saying.
Yeah, radio stations are incredibly influential in Colombia, and they ridicule left-wing positions and working class positions. But as always, because that's how ideology works, they pretend to be in favor of the national interest. So it's
What do you
not that
mean
they.
with the national interest?
Yeah, I mean, they always pretend to ridicule left wing views because they think they are bad for the country as a whole. So they disguise the interests of an elite as the interests of the many, which is not true. Like if you read Machiavelli or whatever political theories, you're gonna see that it's not even Marx. Like Machiavelli was saying that the many have uh, interests that conflict with the interests of the few. That's just an eternal political fact. You're if you go to any a hierarchical society, you're gonna see that that's always true. Like in ancient Rome, in ancient Greece, in Colombia, in the United States, the interests of the many are not always, not in all cases, of course. If the country is invaded, maybe they have interests in common, right? It's not always, but of course, the interests that those media companies represent are not usually, at least, the interests of the many. They're the interests of the few, but by their manipulation, they pretend that they're representing the interests of the many.
And if we talk about the armed conflict, then you could argue that because of the nature of the guerrillas in Colombia that are Marxist, like outspokenly Marxist, against an elite that is outspoken, well, between liberal and conservative,
Mhm.
then you're going to see a media filter that is going to weed out whatever is Marxist. Even though
Yes.
the Marxists may be social democrats and
Yes.
pacifists and you name
Yes.
it.
Yes, yes. So every position that doesn't fit in the establishment is going to be regarded as extreme, even though it may not be extreme. Like, what's extremist about being a social democrat? It's not an extreme position, but a real social democrat, which, for example, um, talks with trade unions, uh, which is part of the European tradition. There's no social democracy without trade unions. But in Colombia, proponents of social democracy tend to just favor some government intervention in the economy and give poor people cash or whatever. But I mean, okay, I'm not against that, but if you want to
So
have
so
a
that would be like a um, so for example, like people who think that like labor unions are an elementary or an essential part of a social democracy, like or a liberal democracy, um, they would not get the media coverage in Colombia that they deserve, like based
no,
on the merit of their proposal.
it's not only that they're going to be excluded because there's a very powerful and aggressive anti-trade union propaganda effort which crystallizes in prejudices and common sense. So even workers in Colombia think that trade unions are a mistake. Not all workers, but many workers think that. And the
And they
professional.
think that because that's what they have learned through the media.
Yes, because the media only shows the corruption in trade unions, which is, of course, like any other human institution, something that you're going to find. But they never say, okay, people
But
in
this
trade
is
unions need more
interesting
money.
because like a trade union is basically a bunch of co-workers who organize so that they can negotiate wages and labor
Uh-huh,
conditions, the
uh-huh,
same way that a neighborhood can organize to talk to the municipality about road signs, whatever. But there seems to be a in Colombian media, and correct me if I'm wrong, like a bias against organized uh, dissent, like in a very fundamental way, like labor unions or
yes,
the juntas, the acción comunal, so like the community action boards
yes.
that exist in neighborhoods. So like it seems that the well, correct me if I'm wrong, but like it seems that any form of like organized or organization in civil society is being frowned upon in the media.
Yes, yes. Unless, you know, it's organized by someone from the elite, in
Or
which case,
by a political party.
yes. So it's even worse than in the United States, Adrian. You know that the United States is a country in which anti-trade union propaganda is pretty common,
Mm-hmm.
and companies even, you know, give to their employees documentaries in which they try to show that trade unions are bad for them, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but in the United States, you can see that teachers, for example, try to organize in unions, like professors at universities, to be more precise. That's something that happens in Colombia, but it's happening less and less because trade unions are being seen as something that's not relevant to the present of many uh, uh, people with university degrees. So it's only for workers, and even for workers, it's bad. So I mean, the propaganda effort has been incredibly um, successful, and that's why they can kill people from trade union
But
members with total impunity.
at that point, media become really detrimental to the health of a democratic society.
Yes,
I mean,
look,
like if you start dismantling trade unions or community organizations, um, I mean, then you're making whatever makes democracy work very limited.
yes, I mean, look, I wouldn't be surprised. We were talking uh, uh, like an hour ago about the different way in which the media reported on the paramilitaries and the guerrillas. I think you could find the same results when they report on trade unions. So whenever they kill a trade union member, which is almost daily or at least every month they kill one, um, I think that the media are going to report it without saying who's the killer and without using the active voice. They're always going to use the passive voice, and they're not going to tell you anything about their personal histories. They're not going to tell you anything about who they were. It's just going to be a fact like this. There's a sunny day.
I I I also can't remember. Um, well, maybe I'm just biased, but I can't even remember media reporting on like the content of policy proposals by, for example, the teachers union FACO.
Mhm.
Like it's a lot of like how that they have a protest and this is how they protest, but they there's barely any insight on like what the grievances are, for example, like of teachers,
Mhm.
and what kind of policy proposals they bring forward to let's say improve education.
Yeah, there is no context.
But there's
So
no content.
yeah, exactly, and there's no content. It's just look. Some years ago, there was a strike from Avianca's pilots,
Mm-hmm.
and they wanted better conditions, and they weren't asking for anything extraordinary. They were just asking for the market rate because they were paying better wages at
And you're
you know
not
other
you're
countries.
talking about airplane pilots, like you're not
Yes,
talking about radical like miners or so.
exactly, exactly, right. They were just asking for market rates because their wages, I mean, pilot wages had been on the rise, and Avianca's wages had been frozen for some years.
Mm-hmm.
So they were asking for all the benefits that pilots had at uh, big um, companies in other countries. And there was a conscious effort by Efremovich, which was Avianca's CEO, and some media companies like Semana, in order to present the strikers as greedy bastards. And I'm not even kidding. They presented them under the worst possible light, and many people became convinced that they were just trying to um, bankrupt Avianca, because that was Efremovich's message. Like
And that they would make uh, tickets even more expensive than they already were.
yes, yes. So there was a conscious effort to present them as capricious and irrational and socialist um, workers.
By the way, at the meantime, they were actually being um, spied on. Like they were
Yes,
actually the victim of uh, uh, a horrible criminal conspiracy.
yes, uh-huh. And every one of their demands was met with scorn. Of course, when you're negotiating, you try to demand a lot of things in order to negotiate, and meet the other person in the middle. So you're not going to ask what you want. You're going to ask more than you want because, right, you want to negotiate. So they were asking for, a lot, but in order to, but they were asking, for example, for iPads, and so it was presented as something that, because an iPad for a regular Colombian is, an unthinkable luxury. It's just too expensive. And but actually, pilots
But
from,
if you're earning a normal wage, an iPad is just another normal commodity.
yeah, but I mean, so the thing is, I asked a friend of mine who's a pilot, and he told me, like, all pilots have iPads, and it's just part of what companies give to them, because they have some apps for pilots, and they use them to navigate, etc. Like, it was something that they needed to work. And I remember clearly that they were presenting the iPads as something that was going to bankrupt Avianca. I mean, because they were going to buy some iPads. That seemed insane, but that was their take. It was a pretty bad take, but people believed it. And what happened in the end was that workers, if my memory serves me right, anyway, I think workers resigned and they found jobs at other companies, and
Where they did get their iPads.
they got their raise, and Efremovich didn't have enough pilots. He had to hire pilots from Bolivia and other places. He couldn't hire enough because he was paying very little, and there, I mean, the company suffered a lot because of it. So he ended up losing more money because he didn't want to raise wages than he would have had if he actually had raised wages.
Yeah.
It's insane. But people had this image of Avianca's pilots as greedy bastards, and Efremovich is just a savvy businessman.
And so instead of media proposing a public debate in which media uh, present a middle ground, like where employers and employees can meet each other potentially,
Hmm.
what they do is they side like with a certain actor in a specific conflict. In this
Yeah.
case, a labor conflict.
Yes, you always hear the side of the employer, but the side of the employee is given very little time, and it's always presented from a distorted perspective. So most people think, like I was saying, even workers think that trade unions are just a demon and they're better off without them. And if you take a look at Colombian wages, you wonder, are they really better without them?
Yeah, you one would think that if people had unions, then maybe wages would be a bit higher.
Yes. Yes, at least, for example, in the financial sector, there are trade unions in the financial sector, but they don't get any media attention. And if they get media attention because their working conditions are pretty bad, while um, the wealth of bankers is just at historical levels, um, if they get any media attention, is going to be uh, again from a negative perspective, whereas the bankers always get a seat, or a representative in media debates, which is complete. So where are the representatives of trade unions and workers of the
Yeah,
financial
or
sector, which make very little, very little.
yeah, yeah. Even though like most people would still be workers, and like a relatively small amount of the population is an entrepreneur or an employer.
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
I'm going to cut it off because I think we've been talking for quite a while now. Um, Tomas Molina, thank you very much. If you want to read more about this subject, you can get Noam Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent. My name is Adrian Alsema, and this was the podcast of Colombia Reports.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you. That was